Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
As anxious citizens gathered outside Independence Hall to learn about what form of government the founders were debating, one, a Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia, asked Benjamin Franklin, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And Mr. Franklin famously answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." Today, we will explore that question in full. What is the status of this republic after witnessing the events that took place on January 6th of this new year? And as President Biden assumes office, what kind of future can this young democratic republic expect? Thank you for joining us for Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator, Stacey Walker. Today, I am joined by another esteemed panel. Laura Belin, political commentator and editor and publisher of Bleeding Heartland, Ty Rushing, journalist, and Paul Gowder, professor of law at Northwestern University. Today, I'd like to begin by contextualizing this a bit and making sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about here. We didn't see a protest or citizens peacefully assembling or petitioning their government for a redress of grievances. What we all witnessed was a violent attack on our government. And Paul, we'll start with you. From your vantage point as a legal scholar, is it appropriate to use words like attempted insurrection when describing this event?
Absolutely, I think it is. And the reason, we can leave aside the question of the legal definition of a notion of insurrection for the purposes of criminal liability. As far as I know, they haven't actually charged any of the participants with a crime quite as severe as insurrection yet. But conceptually speaking, the term is entirely inappropriate. I mean, there's nothing closer to the core of what an insurrection is than an armed attempt to impede the lawful transition of democratic power, which is what that was. I mean, people in that attack on the Capitol, it's really quite clear, had the intention of using force to prevent Congress, not just from carrying out an official function, but from carrying out really its most core official function. I think that insurrection is an entirely reasonable term to use.
So I appreciate that. And Ty, will go to you next, but just how serious was this event? I mean, there were reports from some members of Congress that their panic buttons were ripped from their desks. Other reports suggest that some of these insurrectionists had received help from members of Congress. Several Capitol police officers are under investigation. I mean, Ty, you report on the news. How serious was this event?
Well, I mean, think about this. Like, we've never seen anything like this in America. And what I found very interesting is watching the international coverage of it, because it seemed like what you would see when U.S. media goes into a foreign war zone and covers it and depicts the actions that are happening there, except it was here in America. And then a lot of us who were on social media, we saw it happen in real time. I mean, it was terrifying. I mean, and it's just, it didn't seem real. It didn't seem like something that could happen here. And yet it did.
Right. And Laura, you have written about politics for a long time now. What is your take? What do you make of the events that transpired?
Well, I spent about the first 10 years of my writing career covering Russian politics during the years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency and the early Vladimir Putin years. And I have to say that what is going on now in this country is like nothing I would have ever expected to happen in the United States. And really, I covered election cycles in Russia where this was a scenario that people seriously discussed, that the president might lose the election and refuse to hand over power to the person that won the election. I mean, there were jokes about it. Russians like a lot of dark humor. And I have been calling it a coup attempt on my website because that's exactly what it was. I mean, it was an attempt to subvert the will of the people. It was an attempt to subvert the certified results of several states' elections with no facts to back it up whatsoever. And I am not surprised really that Donald Trump tried to do this, but it is shocking to me that hundreds of Republican elected officials have gone along with this coup attempt, and I find it really scary.
That's my next question, and so we'll stay with you on this, Laura. Many Republicans, including Iowa Republicans, either have yet to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the election, or they were very slow to do so. And in your view, do these Republican leaders bear any responsibility for this at all?
I think they do. I think if a few days after the election, when the key states had been called for Biden, I think if the entire Republican establishment had acted like Mitt Romney and said, congratulations to President-elect Biden, I don't think any of this insurrection would have picked up steam the way it did. Every Iowa Republican elected official has said, at minimum, that Biden will be sworn in as the president, or that Biden won the Electoral College. Not one of them has said that the claims of election fraud are baseless. Not one of them has said that every state that casts its electoral votes for Biden is a state that Joe Biden legitimately won. All of the Republican officials have been couching their statements about Biden. They've said, well, a lot of people have questions, people have concerns, and many people feel that illegal votes were counted or that there were irregularities. And that has contributed to this atmosphere where it was possible to try to steal an election. And in fact, Iowa's Republican National Committee woman, Tamara Scott, is out there still on her Facebook feed saying that the election was stolen.
Right. And it really sort of takes away from some of these other elections that are legitimately close. And one of those elections is in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, where the election was decided on, I think it was like 6 votes or something like that. So you've got people claiming fraud with an election that wasn't close at all. And then when you actually have one, it sort of takes away from it, in my view. But Ty, I'm going to go to you next here. So there have been people, and I am one of them, that made the observation that after these events went down, or while this event was going down, if you will, had these insurrectionists been people of color, we might have seen a different outcome. Do you believe this is true? And if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we saw what happened this summer. You had Black Lives Matter protests sparking all across the country in rural areas that never would have happened. I mean, there was one in Sheldon, Iowa, there was one in Spencer, there was one in Cherokee. Orange City had a justice walk, like communities that you would never think to see these sorts of things happen. And while nothing in those communities escalated, you saw folks in Fargo getting beat down. I mean, you saw folks in Des Moines getting tear gassed. You saw little kids getting tear gassed. You saw photos of Black children on the shoulders of their father getting maced in the eyes. Like, what happened to DC? Had it been people of color protesting and asking for things out there, that wouldn't have happened at all. You wouldn't have seen, the Capitol Police guy opening up the gate. You wouldn't have seen them giving escorted tours through the Capitol building. You would have seen those guys out there in full military gear. You would have saw the tanks. You would have saw all that stuff. I mean, it would have like Selma.
Yeah. And so, Paul, I want to kind of go back to you, sort of along these lines. We had a situation where, and this is according to several reports, where as this violence was ramping up, it was reported that the vice president was the individual on the phone talking to the Joint Chiefs, talking to the head of the National Guard, sort of making security decisions in the absence of the president. Now, you're the constitutional law scholar here. Was that within the purview of the vice president? I mean, the president technically, wasn't, not able to carry out these duties. He wasn't incapacitated. He was absent. So was that something the vice president was within his rights to do? Does it set a precedent for the future? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I am not certain about how the full story has panned out with that one. So as I understand, I've actually talked to a few friends in civil military relations scholarship about this, who've suggested to me, and I have no reason to disbelieve them, I'm in no way an expert on military affairs, that it would be widely recognized as inappropriate among civil military relations scholars of if that's how it actually went down. But the story that I've also been hearing that seems to me more credible is that, I mean, we have to remember that Mike Pence was actually in the building at the time, and that what is being interpreted by some people as Pence being the one who made the call actually was Pence calling up the Defense Department in his capacity as the president of the Senate and saying, hey, we need help here in Congress. And then the actual decision being made by the Defense Department, not by Pence, to send assistance. And if that's true, then I think it's entirely appropriate, assuming, and again, I'm not an expert in military law, but assuming that the Secretary of Defense or whichever general at the Pentagon had the authority to order that deployment without seeking the authorization of the president, which seems plausible, then there's nothing wrong with Pence calling up and saying, hey, I and the people in Congress need your help here.
So fair enough. So at best, the vice president was acting in his capacity as president of the Senate as he was presiding over it during this insurrection. Another question I want to explore is this. I mean, we've got a constitutional law scholar here. We've got an observer of politics and a writer of politics. We've got a journalist, a reporter. We're all making observations about this incident being unprecedented. And we all know that, certain political figures may bear some responsibility in inciting this. But my question is this, because we've gotten to this point in American politics, in American political life, do we have to start thinking about how we do political reporting? Do we have to start thinking about how we're training up the next generation of legal scholars to confront this new reality where people have been permitted to have a platform to spread lies, to incite violence? There's that sort of both sides argument in journalism. Are journalists ethically required to present two sides of a story when one is willfully dishonest? Does this sort of change how we do business? Laura, we'll start with you. What do you think?
Well, I rejected that conventional journalism model on my website more than a decade ago because I think that journalists need to be grounded in facts. And so to present both sides or two sides, of course, there's always more than two sides to a story anyway, but to present both sides when one side is clearly deceptive and willfully so is not serving the readers well at all. So I would be in favor of changing that model. I mean, we've seen even since January 6th that the Sunday news shows are still having a lot of Republican commentators, more Republican commentators, really. And I think that there needs to be a reckoning. And maybe some of the editors and reporters need to talk to people who have experience covering authoritarian regimes. And we need to really start thinking about that, because what happened with this coup attempt, I mean, it was like something you see in a non-democratic country. And so you can't, when elections are a farce and people don't respect the results of the elections, you can't just report people's comments at face value and take their quotes at face value.
Mm-hmm. Ty, you're a journalist, you're a reporter. What do you think about this new reality in which we live, and what is the responsibility of reporters and journalists?
Well, you kind of got the clash between the old school, traditional both sidisms, and then you got the newer generation who wants to just come in and like tell it like it is, which you should, because sometimes you get a lot of walking on eggshells, or people are afraid to say, just call a spade a spade. Perfect example happened with me a couple of years ago with the Las Vegas shooting. Stephen Paddock. I called him. My original copy called him a suspected domestic terrorist, and my editor at the time changed it to multimillionaire, which does not convey what he did or who he was. Like, it's like, how does it, and you're just seeing more of that now with, you got people afraid to call us an insurrection. You're afraid to say, you're calling these people militia groups when they're domestic terrorists. Like, sometimes you just got to like pull off, like just say, stop it. We got to just tell it like how it is, like present these things as facts, say, call these people out for these crazy Facebook comments and rants. Like you just got to put it out there and, use the truth. Like, I mean, and use facts and use information. And instead of just being like, okay, well, they said this and they said this, just get it out there and point out like, hey, this is why this is completely crazy.
Got it. And Paul, we'll go to you. Does this change the way we are training up the next generation of legal scholars?
I think that in the law, the problem's in a lot of ways kind of the opposite. In other words, for lawyers, there's this kind of model of lawyering of here you are, you're an advocate and you're a pure advocate. And it's really in tension with a classical ethics of the lawyer, where what lawyers do is they engage in independent judgment, and up to a point of ridiculousness, the lawyer says, hey, that argument, that claim is nonsense. I'm not going to participate in it. One of the things that has really troubled me for the entire course of this disaster with the election and the insurrection is the number of lawyers that have enabled this behavior, from the ones who filed the frivolous lawsuits in the first place to both Giuliani and a law professor named John Eastman who spoke at the rally, to, speaking of scholars right now who are making arguments about the potential impeachment of Trump that contradict their own prior scholarship, that we've lost the ethics of making independent, honest judgments about the claims that you advance as a lawyer. And I think that in law schools, we need to bring that back.
So let's talk a little bit about impeachment. There was a push by the Democrats to impeach the president. It has happened. For the first time in history, I believe, a president has been impeached twice. And even though, by the time this show airs, we will have a new president, are there sort of lasting impacts that this impeachment will have for the president? We'll stay with you, Paul, on that question.
So absolutely. I mean, the point that people in the law are focusing on is that one of the sanctions that can be inflicted on conviction and after an impeachment is the prohibition from other public office. And so one of the sort of tactical reasons why I think Democrats have thought about impeachment, apart from just expressing the horror at the behavior, is to forestall, well, number one, to forestall pardons as well. One of the provisions in the Constitution carves out the case of impeachment, whatever that means, from the pardon power. And there's some questions about how to interpret that passage, but also to impose a prohibition on occupying public office, which also could be imposed arguably by Congress under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But that's really, I think, probably the main consideration for impeachment right now.
Got it. So, this episode is talking about the future of our republic. And many observers of American politics are talking about what we've experienced over the last 4 years. They're couching it as Trumpism. And Trumpism has proven to be a very real threat to our democratic system here. My question to you, Laura, and then we'll go to Ty. Do you expect, now that we've had a president who's been impeached twice, do you expect Trumpism to persist, to continue? Is this something that we still need to be concerned about in American political life?
Absolutely. I mean, hundreds of members of Congress were on board with throwing out election results based on nothing other than that Trump and his fans didn't like the results of how those states voted. So I have serious concerns that if we have a really close election, this election wasn't actually very close. This was a very convincing victory by 8 million popular votes and by 70 some electoral votes. And in the historical context, I mean, this was a much more clear victory. But what happens if in the next presidential election, what if it is only decided by 1 or 2 states? I'm very concerned that state legislatures might send a different slate of electors, ignoring how the people of their state voted. I'm very concerned that a Secretary of State might bow to pressure from a president or from somebody else to find some votes to change the results. So I think that we are in a very perilous time for democracy. And I really worry, given how many Republicans voted to throw out the election results, if Republicans happen to control both chambers of Congress at the time of the next presidential election, and it's close, I think it's very possible that even if the Republican loses, that the Congress could certify the Republican as the winner.
Ty, the future of Trumpism, will it persist? And if so, how does that impact our democracy?
I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think it's going anywhere at all. I mean, think about it. All right. Every member of the Trump family has made a name for themselves since he's been in office. So, Junior's right there, Eric's right there, Ivanka's right there, Jared's right there. One of them could run next if he can't run again. And that name is already out there. There's one thing he's been great at. It's branding and it's marketing. It's putting his name on things. And he's put his name on the Republican Party. And so, you've heard a lot in the last couple of years about the two, the moderate Democrats versus the far left, the Democrats, and how that party really needs to split into two. But I kind of feel like it's the same way with the Republican Party. You got the traditional GOPers, and then you got the Trump side, And so, that's going to be something to watch, I think, is to see if that splits into two. You got the folks like Mitt Romney who would consider themselves more classic GOP, the Bushes, that sort of thing. And then you got the Trump side, like the, kind of more far right extreme part of the party. And that's not going anywhere.
Yeah. So I'll ask you, Paul, if we accept that Trumpism will be around at least for a little bit, from your vantage point as a legal scholar, what kind of pressures does that apply to our democracy?
Oh, I mean, so I'm honestly less scared about Trump and Trump's family than I am about the underlying polarization that it indicates. I mean, let's be perfectly blunt here. Josh Hawley is like Trump, but with an extra 100 IQ points, which is unbelievably scary to me. And the reason it scares us, I think, both from a legal and a political standpoint, and from a bureaucratic standpoint, just so much of the American public seems to feel just totally alienated from our institutions. And when they're totally alienated from our institutions, again, whether they be our legal institutions and just a lack of respect for our democratic process, whether that be the integrity of ordinary politics, what you'll see is exactly what you're seeing is people are willing, or people become willing, to take truly extreme measures to try to get their preferences into power, whether that's office holders voting to overturn elections, or ordinary citizens coming to believe conspiracy theories and attacking the Capitol. It all comes down to this level of alienation that's just really astonishing.
So I'll stay with you, Paul, and then we'll go to Ty and wrap with Laura on this question. It is no secret that our democracy is fragile. That's the point of this episode. It's been pointed out by many people throughout history. It's no secret that maintaining it takes work. We know that we are in a difficult place now. But what I want to explore is what needs to happen next. What do we need to be doing to course correct, to perhaps prevent something like this from happening in the future? And instead of worrying about how weak our democracy is, figuring out how we strengthen it. So what needs to happen to get us to that point?
For me, I think, frankly, widespread egalitarian policy reform. I think that a lot of it, as I said, alienation is the root of this. I think that a lot of Americans right now, especially with COVID, but even before COVID, are experiencing their lives as going very poorly. And this is something obviously that's racialized and classed, but that also extends certainly across racial and geographic boundaries, even though I think people of color are suffering the brunt end of it. But the level of disregard and even the sort of, paranoid loathing that some people display for our democratic institutions comes from suffering. And I think that one thing that we really need to do is work on alleviating that economic redistribution.
Okay, thank you for that. Ty, what do you think? What do we need to do to sort of get back on track, if you will?
We got to get the money out of politics. Like, the money in politics influences so many things, and and then also you got to make these people in DC be tangible again. That's one thing I love about covering local government is that I can run into the mayor at the store, or I can see them there, and I can ask a question to them, and I can talk to them, and they hear my issue. With Congress, you're going through however many levels of staffers, and it's probably never going to reach the elected officials here. But if you're a lobbyist and you got to big check, you're going to dinner that night. And so we got to take the money out of that. We gotta even the playing field. We got to make it so that people who aren't multimillionaires can, be able to get in there and represent the people in their district back home and, tell, and share their values and share their thoughts and try to make change for the common Joe instead of just, the fat cats.
Gotcha. And Laura, we'll kind of end with you here. What are your thoughts? What do we need to do to get this democracy back on track?
Well, I think unfortunately we don't control our own destiny. So, I mean, different groups of people have different tasks that we all have to focus on. But one thing that none of us here can do is be a voice within the Republican Party telling people the truth. Like Mitt Romney said, that the election was free and fair, that they've been lied to by people saying it was a stolen election. But unfortunately, there's an entire information sphere that has been aggressively pushing these lies. And I'm not just talking about Fox News, but there's a huge conservative talk radio network. There are lots of online sources. And so it's very limited. I mean, we could have great progressive policies that redistribute wealth, and then there could be the fantasy world created by this alternative media that inequality is getting worse and worse. So that's difficult. I think that for people in the more reality-based journalism world, we really have to not give equal weight to views that are not equally credible. And I think that diversity in newsrooms is very important. And I've seen several African-American journalists talking about how early in Trump's presidency, or in some cases even before he was elected president, that they were warning about the white supremacist sentiment that he was animating around the country. And that many of their editors or publishers just thought that maybe that was paranoid, or maybe they were just too close or too sensitive to the issue. And really, the people running some of those media organizations should have been listening more to the Black journalists on their staff. So I think that we need to have more diversity of voices. And I think that we can't be deferential toward views that are just maliciously false.
Excellent. As always, with every episode of Ethical Perspectives, I wish we had way more time, because we could go on and on and on about this. And Laura, you brought up toward the end there the role of diversity in newsrooms, and Paul, you brought up human suffering, and Ty, you talked about money in politics. I mean, we could go on a tangent on any one of these subjects, but we have reached the end of our time here today, and I will close this out with these final words. Last year was incredibly challenging for many Americans and most people around the globe. Here at home, in addition to dealing with the devastating coronavirus outbreak, Americans saw their entire system of government challenged in ways not seen since the Civil War. Yet our Congress continues to deliberate. The transfer of power from one president to another is underway. And by and large, we still believe in our electoral system. One person, one vote, the cornerstone of our democracy. And while we may have stumbled across the finish line this time around, we may not be so lucky in the future. The lesson in all of this is that democracies are fragile and that they require work, and a sober understanding that if this one is to survive, it will be because we chose to keep it. I'm your host, Stacey Walker, and I want to thank you all for joining us on another episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News.